Hi. So I've been wanting to do more wood turning, and I have a whole bunch of these bowl blanks that are dry now. I think this one I did in 2018 in November. So it's almost exactly 2 years, and it feels like it's dry enough to turn. It's got a little crack that's developed, and it's been a while since I've done one of these where I'll cut along that crack and then build an insert to go in that space and then glue everything back together again and turn it into a single piece. What I'm kind of thinking is to do something simple for the insert, and then I want to make sort of spikes that come out of that kind of march along that insert. And the way this crack is, it looks like I can maybe get two of them to fall on the base and then make a third one so it'll sort of sit up off of whatever it's sitting on and sort of sit on those spikes. So it makes it sort of less functional and a little more art, but maybe that'll be fun.
When wood dries, it tends to change shape a little bit. That often means the rim of a dried bowl blank isn't quite flat anymore. But the disc sander works well for that. I have a jig I've made for the bandsaw that will hold the bowl upside down. I think in the past I drilled holes in it to move the hold down piece back a little bit, and I move that forward so that it holds the bowl closer to the edge of the jig. I can put the bowl in place, and it's pretty simple. It just clamps the bowl down to the bed of the jig, and I can angle the bandsaw table to match whatever the crack is in the bowl. And then I can cut the bowl along that line of the crack. And the jig just runs along the edge of the bandsaw table. I don't have a T-track or a slot in my bandsaw table. I think this bandsaw was made before they did that. And once it's cut, I can flatten that surface on the disc sander. I need to make the insert to go into that cut that I've just made. And I have a piece of maple. I want to clean some of the bark off. The chisel worked pretty well, and I used a draw knife, not really to shape it, just get the bark off, and it kind of worked. Then I can get back to power tools and joint one side and one edge. And this will let me cut the piece on the table saw. I'm going to make one segmented ring, and it'll be fairly thick and pretty simple. Just a simple 12 segmented ring. I can set up my segmenting jig and set the width of the segments that I need. I usually cut a few extras just in case I need an extra, or if one ends up having a defect or just isn't right for some reason. These are pretty big, chunky segments. I can set up the ring and kind of make sure it's tight. Then glue the pieces together. And it's just a matter of getting glue in between all the segments and clamp them all together with a hose clamp. Once that ring is dry, I can cut it in half. I decided with the thickness of the ring that I wanted to make, I needed to remove a little more thickness from the bowl. So I cut off some more and I resanded that edge. And I can sand the section of segment that'll be the insert in the bowl. I dry fit everything together and decided I could cut off a little bit more of the ring that I had cut in half, as I didn't need a full half a circle. Then it's just a matter of gluing the three pieces together. And it clamped as a dry fit, so it should clamp as a glued up piece. I can clamp the rim and flip the piece over and then use the tenon on the bottom to clamp the top and bottom of the system together.
So I have the blank ready to be turned. It's all glued together. The two sides have been cut in half. The insert's been put in. And hopefully there's enough material here to find a finished piece. And there should be. It's pretty thick. So the first thing to do is to make the bottom round again. I've added the insert, and it's kind of broken the lip that I had for the chuck. And this piece isn't really as round as it could be. So the first thing to do is to mount it backwards on the lathe. Make this round again, make that lip continuous. Then I can hold this with the chuck. And when I hold it with the chuck, I can then work on the rest of the bowl and get it mostly complete.
I can test the chuck.
Just fits. I was afraid this was going to get too small, because with a bowl this size, you don't want this to get too small, because it just isn't going to have enough strength in the wood to hold it. But these jaws on that chuck just fit this. The next size down is a lot smaller and would probably be too small for this bowl. That's why I'm glad that fit and I didn't go too little.
I can mount the bowl on the tenon that I've made with the chuck. Then it's a matter of getting the outside round. So I'll start by removing the bit of the insert that sticks out. Then I can make it round and start to find the shape that I want. And that shape is going to be pretty simple. It's just going to be a bowl shape. So I just want something that looks nice. I tend to keep the shape pretty simple, just a simple curve. I can work on the edge. And you can kind of see how the shaping goes quicker in the time lapse. You can see that my tailstock dead center, I think is what it's called, is actually rotating within the Morris taper, which it really shouldn't be doing. It's not a big deal, but it's funny that you don't see those kinds of things until you do a time lapse and you see it rotating. Then I can work on the inside, which is fairly straightforward, just cutting out the inside of the bowl. This project isn't so much about making the bowl, as that's fairly straightforward. It's just a bowl with a simple insert in it. Once I get the shape pretty close, I can scrape the surface and get everything smooth. The scraper tends to cut through the ridges that are left by the bowl gouge. You can get a more uniform surface. Then I can sand. And I can put the jumbo jaws back on again. And it's just a matter of shaping the bottom. I realized at about this point that I didn't need a flat spot on the bottom, as the bowl's going to sit up on spikes. And I thought it would be more interesting if the bottom of the bowl just had a simple curve to it, and the bowl wouldn't work without the spikes, as it wouldn't have a spot to sit. It would just be a curved surface. And I sanded the bottom. This part was pretty easy. And the bowl part is done. I can start working on the spikes. I found a piece of walnut that I could use. I was thinking I would make the spikes a contrasty color to the bowl. So the bowl's kind of light cherry and maple, and I'd make the spikes out of walnut. And I jointed two sides of the piece of walnut. That was just so I could hold it on the CNC table. Then on the CNC, I can cut cylinders into the end of the piece of walnut, and each one of these cylinders will become a spike. And I've sized these so they'll fit into a hole made by my 1-inch Forstner bit. I did that several times to get the number of spikes I needed. So each pass I got 4. And I can cut that section off from the bigger piece of walnut. Then cut each spike apart and get sort of a blank. I started with the table saw, and when I got down towards the last 2, it felt a little too dangerous. So I cut them apart on the bandsaw, and that was a lot safer. Then I can mount each one of these spike roughs, or spikelets, on the lathe and make spikes. And it was just a matter of shaping those. I used the tailstock until the very end. I could do the final shaping without the tailstock, as I needed to work on the end. And I could sand, and that went really fast because they're so small. So I did that 9 times, I think, making all the spikes that I wanted. Then I wanted to drill 1-inch holes into the bottom of the bowl that I had turned. I laid out where I wanted to put the spikes. And when I was happy with that, I started to drill the first hole. And it seemed like it was going okay. But when I was done with the hole, it was kind of a failure. The drill and the drilling jig worked just fine, but holding the bowl on the jumbo jaws like this doesn't really work when you're trying to drill into the bowl. As I got a much bigger than 1-inch hole and it wasn't even round. And at this point, I put the project aside and decided I would think about it. So a month passed,
Bed goes up.
and I decided it'd be better to try and drill the holes on the CNC machine. Not so much because the CNC machine is more accurate or I can do anything more interesting than make a round hole, but that I can hold the bowl shape much more securely, and hopefully in a way that it doesn't move while I cut the holes in it. So I set up sort of an area for the bowl to sit. And I decided my first hole, I would just make a bigger spike, and I would just make that circle bigger. Then I could move the bowl for each of the other spikes. Now, as the plane that I cut for the crack doesn't run perpendicular to the rim of the bowl, I couldn't just rotate the table of the CNC to get the different hole locations. I had to rotate the table and rotate the bowl a little bit to get each spike to be perpendicular to the curve of the outside of the bowl, if that makes sense. So I kind of eyeballed this process and got it as close as I could. I figured if it looks right, then it is right. And I just cut each hole, trying my best to get that hole at the very top of the curve for each cut. And I made a bigger spike for that first hole that I fixed. I had thought about building an inlay or sort of doing something a little fancier with the bowl, but I didn't really have a way to hold it on the lathe to return it. I decided it'd be easier just to make a bigger spike and not try and do any lathe work on the bowl itself. Making the bigger spike was the same as the other spikes. It was just a bigger diameter hole that it fit into. It looks a little cartoony, but... The other spikes I decided were much too long, and I cut them shorter. And I could reshape those on the lathe once I cut the end off. This was a small enough turning piece that I could just use the scraper to remove that corner and reshape the piece. And I could sand that really fast. It was tiny at this point, so it sanded very quickly. I could even do a little shaping with the sander. So I did all of those. Then I could put them in place. And they fit in so they would stay in without any glue. I could get an idea of what it was going to look like. I wanted to remove a little bit of the cylinder that I cut on the CNC machine and that I had used to hold the spike on the lathe. So I used the very precise calipers to kind of just eyeball the amount that I wanted to remove on the back side of the spikes. One thing I did want to get fairly close was that the 3 spikes that the bowl would sit on the very bottom, I wanted those to be the right length so that the bowl would sit level. So I spent some time getting those exactly the right length. Then the spikes can go in. And we can see exactly what it's going to look like. Then it's just a matter of gluing each of the spikes into place. And then I can add finish. I'm putting on walnut oil. And as usual, the end grain section of the bowl really soaks up the oil. So I need to put a lot on. But it was straightforward, and the wood's really pretty. And the spikes look a little cartoony, but I kind of like them. I didn't have the spikes come all the way through to the inside, as I didn't have a way to really hold the bowl and return the inside. So I kept the spikes just on the outside. It worked out. One of the best things about this project is it's given me some ideas for future projects. Thanks for watching.